Thanks very much. So I appreciate being here. Joe mentioned I teach a class now. Just started this year. This great big lecture class I co-teach with somebody else on. It's called Drugs, Mind, and Society, or something like that. And so many different levels of analysis. Such an interesting topic that you could attack, you could think about from all these different levels. And of course, you know, in my actual job, I do this tiny little thing that's just one little piece of it. And so I feel like a poser half the time telling them about things like, you know, grassroots meetings that exist. I think about it. But it's great to be here and hear the comments from the two speakers that I got to listen to. So I appreciate that. I shall also say that my point of entry here is very specific and different than I think most people's point of entry in this room. In that, for me, the 12-step, which I know from your point of view, it's like this huge thing that's everywhere, and it's like, well, what else is there? What else can there be? What else works? What else might work better for some people? From my point of view, I don't even know. I don't see 12-step, right? I hear about the specific brands of psychotherapy that come out of academia with that long lag that Marty mentioned. I love the progress measured in funerals. But in the academic medical realm, there's been a history to how addiction has become something that is at least in part seen in medical terms, and these are paraphrasings of the criteria that make up what is the definition of addiction or substance dependence as we currently have it, and it's about to change because there's a new version coming out. It's exciting and interesting, but I'll just avoid the controversies that are going to be at the door when that one hits, and just say for these, you can think about those first two I've got circled as really the first wave, I think, of mainstream medical treatment of addiction, or thinking about it in terms of a medical phenomenon or even a psychological phenomenon. So there's this thing that can be measured, tolerance and withdrawal. There are biomarkers. You can see tolerance, and you can work with it in the lab, and you can extend it to interesting things like conditioned withdrawal. And so in the 50s, 60s, this was the big area of progress. And then following that, this grouping at the bottom, which this is just my, it seems like a grouping to me. These have to do with the power of drugs, what makes them compelling, what makes them rewarding to individuals. These three criteria, I think, have to do with that. And we learned a great deal in the 80s and 90s about what that's all about from the standpoint of neuroscience. This was a period where we were able, new tools come out, and you could see new things, and we could see commonalities in most of the drugs that people get into trouble with in terms of what they do to particular circuitry in the brain. So particular systems were identified that are relevant to these three. But still leaves what to me is the most interesting piece of this, which is this self-control struggle piece. So this intention, this back and forth, which I think happens over time, and intention is made, and then behavior doesn't conform to that intention. So this self-control segment is captured in these two criteria, taking more than intended and unsuccessful efforts to cut down. This is a quote from a prominent psychologist, 1973, "Principles of animal behavior can provide a basis for a theory of human drug use and abuse, but that voluntary control of addictive behavior requires uniquely human cognitive processes. So this is roughly there's no huge mystery from the standpoint of neuroscience in terms of why people get into trouble with substances. Now, of course, this too is a complicated actual issue because people take drugs for different reasons and get different things from it, and of course these things get simplified when they are put in the lab. But at least you can get rats to self-administer drugs to the point of being in bad shape. That can be modeled, so we can play with brain circuitry, we can play with chemistry and get inside what at least looks like the same kind of process that is at least a big piece of what makes drugs compelling to people. But what do you make of when people, despite having this path of very quick access to reward or relief, stop? How does that happen? Now that's something that Logan in this quote is arguing is hard to model. Our animal models don't seem to do it justice. But as a psychologist, my presumption is that it is as much rooted in our brains as anything else. And so the challenge is, okay, can we both acknowledge that this is probably involving processes that are too complex to be modeled in animals? So we do some degree of justice to just how distinctly human and complex it is when people voluntarily stop, but at the same time don't resort to something mystical purely in our description, as we still hopefully can identify gears that turn at some level. So this, and I think there is this general tension between simplification, so that we can study it as scientists, and an appreciation for what the actual phenomenon is. And sometimes you can look at research and you can say, well, they're clearly oversimplifying it to the point that it's meaningless, the progress that's being made. But the tension is you want to operationalize, you want to make that question something that you can at least keep busy trying to answer, and then you worry about whether your answer means anything. So I'm going to sort of be dealing, I think, with that spectrum in what I talk about. So I should speak until what time? Because I have more slides. Also,
officially 12:15, but we won't.
Well, I'll keep it close. Yeah. So when people do recover, so thinking about that mysterious process that Logan was referring to that doesn't seem to be modeled so well with our rats. Well, when people do recover, when they do this thing of stopping, this well-established pattern, what do they say? Well, let's at least think about what people say as a starting point. They might talk about having hit rock bottom. Here I'm collecting things that I've read that may or may not be representative. They may talk of a spiritual awakening. They may talk of a life-changing experience. They often experience it as a struggle, one that often described as the greatest struggle of their lives. And they may have utilized some fellowship group. And when I was kind of getting interested in the phenomenon of self-control, struggle, and I started to work in an addiction group at the University of Pennsylvania as a postdoc, there was this study that was just coming out that kind of stuck with me. It was a face-off between a competition between different types of treatment for cocaine addiction. And in psychiatry and psychology research, there's a lot of these sorts of face-off studies, and the usual results are very boring, because the usual results are, within any particular treatment, there are therapist effects. So there are good therapists and bad therapists. But then you compare the treatments and there's always a tie. They basically, they all are good and we can all feel good, but nobody really wins and we don't know what we've learned by the $1 million we've spent on the study. But this one seemed, at least in the short term, to have an answer, and it was one that I thought was surprising. And this was, I'm simplifying the study. Everybody was encouraged, multi-site, 400 or 500 participants, was encouraged to do 12-step facilitation. To go to meetings, and I'm guessing it was all, or virtually all, 12-step meetings. And in addition, 3 groups were randomized to also get an individual treatment. I'm just going to focus on that. One, it was cognitive behavioral therapy, so they got one-on-one time with a professional CBT, and this was coming out of University of Pennsylvania where CBT started, so they got a fair shake in terms of this competition. Supportive expressive therapy, another style of psychotherapy. And the third was just one-on-one time with a drug counselor, somebody who was themselves likely through the 12-step program or something like that, and their one-on-one time was just geared at pushing that line or getting them to go to meetings, those sorts of things. I actually don't have a clear idea of what goes on in these meetings, but these were the results. This was the percentage of lost users. I did this on a Mac, and I lose some things, I think, when I go to PC, but the percentage of people who were abstinent for this much time during the study, 1 month, so the longer the period of time that they made it, the fewer made that hurdle. And you see the 12-step group actually beat these professional psychotherapies. I'm sure the CBT people were disappointed by these results. It seemed like, wow, well, that's interesting. What's going on there? And if you break it down, one of the things they did in the study was ask each day or each weeks, I think 3 times, how much are you craving now? Are you thinking about going back to the drug? And they looked at, they separated out between low, medium, and high, just breaking it into 3 groups, and looked at whether they took, they were mostly crack smoking individuals, whether they smoked crack the next week as a function of which of those, how much craving they said they had. And if you split it up like that, the place where you saw this differential, that is the purple bar being low, this is the amount of percentage of people who actually used that next week, the place where that purple bar is different than the other 2 is that high craving response to the high craving. I'm presuming it's response. What happened the week after? And it was there where they looked better than the professional psychotherapies. And that sort of fits the common sense way that people use the word willpower. So if you're not in the mood for something, it's not willpower to not do it. But if you have the urge and don't, then people, in everyday life, we call that an act of self-control or willpower. So that's interesting. So from my point of view, I'm thinking, okay, well, if we're interested as psychologists in the mechanics of what's going on with self-control and willpower, we should be paying attention to what's coming out in grassroots organizations and try to understand what is actually the active ingredient in these sorts of things. Please feel free to stop me at any point. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, as a psychologist and a neuroscientist, the ways in which I and others think about self-control. And the big distinction, I think, is between what you could call dual systems models of self-control or synchronic competition. That is, that self-control struggle finds its, who is the struggle between? Well, one answer that I think is more appealing than real, but I'll get to that. But one answer is that it has to do with a competition between different neural systems. So we have in us one way of thinking, or one brain system, and that has one set of interests, and but also a second brain system, and that has a different set of interests. And when we are feeling ambivalence about something, that experience is actually the manifestation of these two systems that are in competition. While I say from the beginning, I think that's a very intuitive way of thinking about it. I think in the end, as far as the neuroscience, it's not quite what's going on, and I'll hopefully give you a sense of why I think it's different.
Do you want us to interrupt or?
Please, yeah. It doesn't. Like I said,
Back to the studies,
yeah,
comparing the groups.
yeah.
Have there been any hypotheses about why the 12-step groups seem to be more successful?
Well, so that it may not seem like much progress, but that second graph I showed you, the first one was from the original paper, which I think was published in the Archive of General Psychiatry, that showed that there was a group difference. That second graph was several years later a follow-up analysis that tried to get a little bit inside of what was making a difference. And their conclusion was that it might have something to do with response to craving being differentially impacted by the different approaches. But yeah. And I think there's studies that try to look at, well, are the people who succeed more, is it the social side of things? And all those things are purely correlational. It's very difficult to make any strong interpretations from correlations because you don't know. People are self-selecting into all these things. So there's really, I don't think, much more to be gained from that data set in particular. But then there are tons of other studies that try to, a few studies at least, that try to separate out pieces that are thought by some to be active ingredients of 12-step especially, because that's got the most attention.
You should compare group CBT to 12-step.
Well, this study, I've cut it a little bit. This group, there was actually 4 groups. Oh, group CBT. I see. That's interesting. So you want it like apples to apples. You want a group CBT with a single
My intuition
facilitator.
is that social pressure is a very powerful ingredient.
Yeah.
Group identification.
Well, so all across the groups, they all were going to meetings, the 12 steps. So they all had that. That was a constant in the 3. But only one group had this kind of pairing that was maybe synergistic between what the individual was saying and what the group was saying. I certainly don't want to... The take-home message, I definitely don't mean to be that 12-step beat is better than CBT or supported expressive therapy. Only that for me, it suggested that there was something interesting to look at with regard to basically facilitation systems that emerge organically, which is probably not interesting from your point of view because it's common sense that who knows what works, people who are involved with the addiction. But from an outsider's point of view, it was kind of a wake up to me as far as the distinction between what's going on in psychology research versus what's going on in the rest of the world.
How much time was in the study?
They followed them up, I believe, a year. It's difficult to even further out you go, especially with a crack addicted population. It's hard, the yield of getting people back is always makes it challenging to interpret the results.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm going to argue. I'll show you a little bit about the dual system models. Maybe I'll skip over some stuff because the one part I do want to get to is what I think is critical for understanding what people are thinking about in everyday self-control. What I think is an actual important insight. It's not my insight, but to get there, I do want to cover that second large bullet, the intertemporal bargaining models. And if I have time, which I'm sure I won't, I'll talk about some fMRI work. No, I actually forget that. I'm going to skip some slides here, but I'll just tell you that, remember I mentioned this trade-off between simplifying so that you can actually do good science versus actually making contact with the phenomenon. One very simple model that's sometimes used for self-control is called response inhibition. So basically, you start to do something. You can think of it as it's a good example. You I can't think of an example, so I'm going to tell you what the actual task is. You have to respond as quickly as you can, whether something is pointing to the left or right. But once in a while, a tone after the target appears comes on, and you have to stop this thing that you're doing. So it's basically your ability to pull back on a motor response. That's been studied a great deal, and we know a lot about the brain circuitry that's relevant to that. And there's been some evidence, not very convincing, but that there is some general connection between this and addictive behavior, so that maybe there's a generalized inhibitory control phenomenon that we can get into with this kind of simple laboratory task that has some relevance to whether somebody can, oh, I just got the idea of using, that sounded good, but wait a second, can I stop that plan that got set in motion? That's, that's the sort of connection that people are looking to make, and we can, and skip some results in this. So there's some suggestion that that's consistent with this, but I will tell you, but for reasons that I'll get to, I don't think that's a big piece of the puzzle. What?
It's a Narcotics Anonymous meeting, and they just did the Serenity Prayer. Sorry.
Hopefully everything's peaceful and serene. So another way people have tried to make contact in the lab with self-control struggles is through something called...
Could you speak a little bit louder, because they've got noisy over here.
Tell them to speak more. Sorry. I'll try. So one way we can have tried to make contact with this phenomenon is by bringing to the lab assessments of people's what's called temporal discounting, the extent to which they are motivated by things in the near future versus the far future. So of course, this is my favorite quote about addiction. If the headache would only precede the intoxication, alcoholism would be a virtue. Brilliant remark. We can. Maybe this is putting too fine a point on it, but if you imagined that the relief that you'd get from going back to using wouldn't come for 20 years if you went back to the needle or whatever it was, but that you'd immediately go through the struggles that come along with addiction, it would not be a challenge to stop using. If that relief came 20 years after using, no problem. People would make a plan, and that would be that. It's an extreme scenario, but it suggests that it's important how people, something about the immediacy of the contingencies is important here. And from that perspective, so it happens with addictive things, the benefits of using, whether it's a reward or relief, those are immediate, but the benefits of quitting generally accrue slowly over time. We don't get our life back all at once. So the simple-minded idea is, okay, well, if that's the case, then maybe some people, in general, the immediate looms larger than the expected future, but maybe this is more true for some people than others. Maybe some of us are more present-focused than others, and if that's the case, then that'd be a reasonable candidate for a risk factor for addiction. And so psychologists have tried to come up with ways of operationalizing, of putting a number on the extent to which you versus Somebody else devalues things as a function of their delay. They're what's called temporal or delayed discounting. So we all discount things in the future. Some people maybe do it more than others. And the standard is many ways you could do this, but one approach is to give people, and it's the most common approach, questions about money. Would you prefer $1,000 now or $1,000 in a year? So I'm just giving you a bunch of questions at once, but think of them each independently. Everybody would say, duh, $1,000 now for sure. If it's $100 now or $1,000 in a year, question 10, by no means all, but most people say, well, I'll wait the year for a tenfold increase on my money. But somewhere in between, people are at the point of stochastic indifference. It's like, well, half the time you ask them $600, I'm just imagining for somebody, at $600, they might say, I'll take it now. I'll take the $600 now, but maybe another time you ask them, they say, oh, wait, they're right there on their indifference point. That tells us something. That gives us a way to put a number on it. That says, by virtue of being delayed 1 year, 1,000 was devalued to be worth just 600. So it gives us a way to quantify people's present focus, the degree to which they discount the future. Lots of studies have looked at whether people who are either currently addicted to substances or in the past were addicted to substances do this temporal discounting more than some comparison group. And what I'm showing you is a collection of about 10 or so of these studies. It's called meta-analysis. It just looks at try to collapse across studies and say, make a generalization. And the finding, for what it's worth, is yes, there is a difference. The effect size you would consider to be, in psychology terms, moderate. Basically, if the 50th percentile in the one group is like the 60th percentile in the other. It's not a huge effect, but there's an on-average difference.
What's an effect size?
It's a stats-ish question. So it's basically, if you think of the distribution of the population, the easiest way to think of it. So think of the bell curve of the population. If you want to know how the effect sizes would tell you, we've got two populations, two separate bell curves. How much is the one moved over? And this tells us that the one is moved over basically a little bit, just about so that the midpoint of one is at the 60th percentile of the other. I guess the punchline is it's a small but consistent, relatively consistent effect. There's another question that you might ask. What does that mean? Does that mean was that there before? I mean, the emphasis in the literature is on the interpretation that it is a risk factor, but it's equally plausible that it's a consequence of being in that mind state, of being in that situation. There's some interesting data that's recently come out that's looked at people who, longitudinally, who transitioned from a heroin addiction to a methadone maintenance, and they shift to discount less deeply. So I think there's some evidence that at least part of the causal arrow is in the other direction. Now, this gets a little bit into inside stuff, but there was a lot of excitement about an idea that basically this temporal discounting comes from a competition between brain systems that are both part of us. There's one old brain system that is very present-focused and one newer brain system that's more the lateral prefrontal cortex and parietal cortex that is far-sighted. And I won't try to give you the details in the amount of time I have, but the argument was that the results from initial brain imaging studies were putting the collective finger on these two brain systems. So the quote in a paper that's been very well cited in neuroscience literature, particularly by areas a little outside of this specialty, because within the specialty we now have been moderately discredited. But the idea is seductive. It's competition between lower level automatic processes that may reflect evolutionary adaptations to particular environments, and a more recently evolved, uniquely human capacity for abstract, domain, general reasoning, and future planning. Okay, so that's, I should, maybe discredit is too strong. There's data that's, doesn't conform to the pattern that this predicts. So this is attractive to the economists because to the extent that they deal with self-control struggle, this is is basically based on an economic model of two-factor model of self-control and temporal discounting. And it's also a nice fit, and the reason it gets picked up, I think, uncritically is because it's a wonderful fit with our intuitions that we have, our devil and our angel that are part of us, and there's where the competition resides. A few reasons why I think, on the face of it, this isn't going to be a satisfactory mapping by itself of self-control struggle. And you know, I do this sort of work, and I do think the modularity that exists in the brain is this exciting new piece of information we have, and it's the best chance of making progress. But I'm going to be arguing in the next 5 minutes that we need to think about this self-control, this intertemporal bargaining perspective as well. A couple points that don't fit well with the angel-devil conception. It's securing a drug is not like a reflex, so it often brings out the cognitive best in the people who are seeking the drug. So if you imagine that there was the dumb system was the devil, you at least have to grant that it has full power over whatever the smart system is during that. So there's something that needs to be wrestled with that conception right off the bat. Another, it's a subtle point, but craving doesn't work the way you'd want it to work. If the idea was we have the things that we truly want, but then we get this thing, this exogenous hit of craving, and that thing, if it's strong enough, pushes us away from the things that we actually want. The piece that I find to not fit with that way of thinking, this is a quote from a Nobel Prize-winning economist, but other people have made this, I've noticed this. Addicts suffer noticeably less withdrawal discomfort when in an establishment that has a reputation for absolute incorruptibility, unbribable guards, etc. Cardiac pulmonary patients who are told flatly that they must stop completely at once if they want to survive the year, stop from smoking, report surprisingly less withdrawal discomfort than those who succeed in quitting after getting the less absolute advice. This was sort of in the lore, like the professional ideas, but without any data. A nice paper in psychopharmacology came out a couple of years ago that put this to the test with Hasidic Jews who were smokers, who had it very well established on the Sabbath. They did not smoke. And they compared that to a couple other conditions, regular days, and a day with less absolutes, but an intent to not smoke. And that low line is the amount of craving that they experience throughout the days, throughout the Sabbath. You see it perking up there at 7 o'clock when the sun goes down. So the idea, the subtle point is that it's not as though the craving is hitting and it is before our choice and leading from the outside to a choice, but the choice itself is feeding back to the craving. When there's some mental foreplay with the act, I might really do it, there is an explosion of craving. So we have to think of craving it puts craving in a different place than I think the simple-minded approach has it.
I think of the times when the element of surprise would make it worse, where I would be invited to dinner, expecting to have several drinks, and get there, and the people say, well, we don't drink. And I would have a terrible time. On the other hand, if we knew in advance that these people didn't drink and there would be no alcohol, the problem wasn't nearly as severe.
Yeah.
Does that relate to this?
Yeah, absolutely. So it says that you were doing something. There was something that was happening in your mind that was getting ready for this thing. It's the
Preparation.
foreplay in your mind, and so that's what
drunk before dinner.
huge. Let me skip over one so I can get to. I just want to say one thing positive, because I'm just saying, just casting stones on. This is, I think, the exciting point that comes mainly from the work of my mentor, George Ainsley. And I'll just give you what I think are the key ingredients. So we don't make decisions, and this gets right to this issue of, well, what can't we model so well with the rats? People do not treat every decision they make as a single decision. That is, unlike the rat, we see things in categories and make decisions about those categories. We may not stick with those decisions, but we are ready as linguistic creatures to think about categories of behavior. We also make plans for our future self. That is, we don't just decide, we don't just make a decision at that choice point where we actually affect the decision. We, in advance, come up with a plan. If your future self, so you have one of these things, a plan about your behavior, in some cases your future self is a foreseeable answer to your current plan. Your current self wants something, but you remember you wanted that thing in the past and your own future self got in the way. That's already a starting point that puts you in a different place than the rats. And we can just think of this situation, simplify it. Imagine two alternatives paired with two time points. So we can always either drink or be sober. And the time points are now and in the future. Okay, so we are making a decision about now and the future. Imagine that sober begins with a C because something that I won't get into. Okay, so C stands for sober. So we can either be drunk now, we can choose to be drunk now and drunk in the future. We can choose to be drunk now and sober in the future, or be sober now and drunk in the future. Nobody chooses that. Or sober now and sober in the future. Those are four in principle alternatives. Now, if those are really the alternatives, given what we know about motivation, if that's all we've got, then self-control, then the most compelling alternative is always going to be drunk now and sober tomorrow. I'll eat the cake now and I'll die tomorrow. Then you've got everything. You've got the best of both worlds. You have these self-control problems when the preference is different for the now and the future. So the typical self-control problem, if these four are really the options, the most attractive is number one, drunk now, sober in the future, but of course tomorrow comes, and then tomorrow is the now, so it's drunk today and sober in the future, and obviously you never get to a point where that stops. Because with experience, we realize that our plans are uncertain, and at that point, it's not that the drunk now, sober tomorrow becomes unappealing, it's that it becomes implausible. We have said that in the past, and we've failed in the past, so we learn to not trust that as an option. So if that's seen as not an option, if we see it no longer as attainable, if it's the case that sober now, sober in the future beats drunk now, drunk in the future, then you've got the ingredients, I think the starting ingredients for potentially successful self-control. And from this is kind of a different way of thinking from common sense economic way of imagining human behavior. It's not that the one cigarette ever is seen as not worth it. What if you really want that cigarette? It'd be great right now. What is the literal downside of one cigarette? One cigarette is very small. It's very uncertain. It's very far in the future. If I see that one cigarette as just one cigarette, there's no hope that I won't smoke it. And this is, why do people say it's just this one? Well, it's a bad decision. Each one is a bad decision if you're thinking about it in strict economic terms, but that's not how we're doing business. We come to see individual cases as being important as precedents for our behavior within the category. So that one cigarette, I might say no, if that one cigarette isn't just that one cigarette, but my whole resolution is seen as importantly in the balance with that one choice. So that's kind of I think it's people all do that and all know it, but it's basically foreign to most of academic treatments of the topic, which treat these decisions as happening in isolation. So the insight, I think, is to see the critical ingredient as being a perceived connection between individual acts and these larger categories of behavior. So to get back to these two different ways of doing the modeling, to understand, I think, what people are actually have in mind when they are trying to, what they're trying to explain with regard to self-control, struggle, and ambivalence, it is this process that has to play out over time between plans, resolutions, transgression, regret, a reconsideration of what each act means, this special sort of plan that we call a resolution. What is the force of that plan? I have some things to say, but nothing much about these, so I'll just throw them out and stop since I'm over. But it's a phenomenon, I think, that can only be understood by thinking of the dialogue over time within the self. So from the standpoint of neuroscience, the trick is to figure out how what we're learning about brain systems maps onto that dialogue. And I think the seductive misstep is to imagine that it is a direct mapping, that we can find the self-control conflict as occurring between modules existing in the brain at the same time. So how do you take questions? Yeah.
Let's see. It looks to me like you sort of have moved the choice point from arguing systems back and forth to this assessment of credibility. And so has there been any work in sort of how the brain assesses credibility of future options and how it discounts them? That seems to be what you moved to.
Yeah.
And, and you described it as a yes/no, but it's really probably a
That's right. That's right.
Over a tipping point.
That's right. And so, I mean, first, the short answer is no, but I love that it's beautifully put. It's exactly true. And I've simplified what really we're talking about is the differential, if you want to hold on to rational choice as being what's going on, is the differential between my expected future self's behavior under these two circumstances, the differential of whether I drink today or not, neither probability is 0 or 1 in either case, is that differential seen as sufficient. Now, so that's where work is sometimes, a little bit is done in modeling how that might happen, and there we get into game theory approaches, basically, because it's hard to get inside people's heads in this kind of way. But then there's also this other thing, I think, that makes things yet more complicated. This is how I think is important for how things sometimes work. But when they fail, maybe it's because people lose hope that their future self will be cooperative even if they are. Maybe it's because they become overconfident and think they can have the defect now and sober later. But I think another thing that sometimes happens is there is also the decision to attend to things or not. And so there is understanding the behavior of attention, and in some cases the individual may willfully, for reward reasons, for reasons that are not huge mysteries, willfully not attend to the aspect of the contingencies, which makes the problem yet harder. So the reason I think that this way of looking at things is not dominant is in part because people want to make progress, and there's a lot of invisible variables here, so it makes it hard. But then again, from my point of view, you want to be actually correct also, and I think this is what happens.
But you're doing sort of a predictive utility function, so I mean you've got some. I mean it's not that far away from.
Well, it's a predictive utility function, but the key players here, there's an internal feedback of things you can't see. It's my own.
Okay.
Preference is affecting my own choice, and my own perceived choice is affecting my own valuation, and so that makes it a chaotic system in principle, so that's where the game theory comes in.
You might consider looking again at one of the options there, which was sober now and drunk in the future. Because that's a little mental trick that a lot of people in recovery actually use. Very
Yeah,
successfully.
yeah. So this is like it's just too. I can't. The thought that I'm going